So I had a little problem with the film because right after the film,
Since your garment is torn, you may help yourself to my furs, Barbarella.
was a bit objectifying of me and of women. So
Love.
Shall I tell you what I would like?
I think I know.
I've complicated feelings about the film.
When Jane Fonda stepped onto the set of Barbarella in 1967, she had no idea she was about to become a pop culture icon. But at what cost? What fans didn't see was the constant battle she fought with her infamous costumes, which seemed determined to fall off at every possible moment. But why did Jane Fonda really take on this bizarre, over-the-top role? What was going on behind the camera that left her feeling humiliated and furious? Join us as we dive deep into Jane Fonda's costume in Barbarella, kept falling off, and she hated it. From Hollywood royalty to reluctant star, how Jane Fonda's early life shaped before Jane Fonda was floating around in zero gravity and fighting off evil aliens in Barbarella. She was navigating life as the daughter of one of Hollywood's biggest stars, and trust me, it wasn't always glamorous. Born December 21, 1937 in New York City, Jane was the daughter of legendary actor Henry Fonda, known for classic films like The Grapes of Wrath and 12 Angry Men. You'd think growing up around red carpets and movie sets would make her eager to jump into the spotlight. But surprisingly, that wasn't the case at all. Jane's childhood was far from the fairy tale people imagine when they think of Hollywood kids. Her mother, Frances Ford Seymour, tragically died by suicide when Jane was only 12 years old. A heartbreaking event that left a deep scar on her life. As a result, Jane grew up with a complicated relationship with fame and her famous father, who was emotionally distant and strict. Still, there was no denying that acting was in her blood, even if she wasn't rushing to embrace it at first. After briefly attending Vassar College, she decided to study art in Paris.
Wait for me! What do you want of me?
But life had other plans. When she returned to the United States, a chance meeting with famous acting coach Lee Strasberg, yes, the same Strasberg who taught Marilyn Monroe and Al Pacino, changed everything. Strasberg saw something special in Jane and encouraged her to join his actor's studio. That was the moment she began to believe she might actually have what it takes to shine on screen. Her early acting gigs? Oh, they were pretty classic 60s fare. She kicked off her career with roles in light comedies like Tall Story, 1960, where she played opposite Anthony Perkins, yep, Psycho himself, and Walk on the Wild Side, 1962, which definitely pushed the envelope at the time. But even as Hollywood fell in love with her blonde bombshell looks and quirky charm, Jane struggled with self-confidence, often feeling like she didn't quite belong in the movie world.
I don't think I'm going to be able to recognize him, sir.
No.
Little did she know, she would soon become one of its brightest stars. But here's one fun fact. Before Barbarella, Jane was known more for her roles in romantic comedies and dramas, and she was already an Oscar nominee by the time she put on that famous and frustrating space costume. Oh, you thought Barbarella was just a fun, over-the-top space adventure with Jane Fonda floating gracefully in zero gravity? Think again. Behind all those glittery sets, campy lines, and seductive stares was a behind-the-scenes storm that could rival any sci-fi disaster. And at the center of all that chaos, Jane Fonda herself, frustrated, uncomfortable, and totally over it. First off, Jane wasn't exactly jumping for joy when she agreed to do the movie. Sure, she was married to the film's director, Roger Vadim, but let's just say working with your spouse on a space-age, sexy sci-fi flick isn't exactly what every woman dreams of. Vadim, famous for his obsession with turning his leading ladies, including Jane, into sex symbols, had a very specific vision for Barbarella. And by specific, we mean super revealing, super sensual, and totally over the top in all the wrong ways.
Mother Retro Earth Girl, I know you don't really exist.
That may be, Your Majesty, but we'd better stick to what we see.
Jane, on the other hand, was an up-and-coming actress with real talent. She didn't want to be remembered as just the girl in the metal bikini floating around in a spaceship. She constantly pushed back against Vadim's more risque ideas, which made for some very awkward conversations on set. Imagine trying to argue with your husband while wearing a barely-there costume surrounded by a crew and cameras rolling. Yikes, right? And speaking of awkwardness, the tension didn't end there. The production itself was a giant melting pot of miscommunication. The film was shot mainly in Italy, but the crew came from all over Europe, with French, Italian, and English-speaking members trying to piece this bizarre film together. So when Jane would ask for something, whether it was a costume fix, a break, or just some sanity, half the crew didn't even understand her, and the other half was too busy trying to make Vadim's wacky visions come to life. Tito, if that wasn't enough, let's talk wardrobe disasters. Because Jane's biggest fight wasn't just with her husband, director, or the crew, it was with her own costume. Imagine wearing an outfit so tiny, so fragile, and so poorly designed that it falls apart in the middle of a scene. And now imagine that happening again and again. Yes, Jane Fonda's costume was constantly slipping, tearing, or straight up falling off.
But you could also think, aren't I using the organization just the way the gay...
Leaving her scrambling to cover herself while cameras were rolling. At some points, she was more focused on holding her outfit together than remembering her lines. And let's not forget, this was the 1960s, long before actresses had the power and voice they have now. So Jane had to smile and pretend everything was fine when she was, in reality, deeply uncomfortable and even embarrassed by what was happening. To make matters worse, Vadim seemed to ignore her concerns, more interested in making her look like a space goddess than actually listening to what she wanted as an actress and as his wife. By the time Barbarella wrapped, Jane was emotionally drained and furious, and although the film later became a cult classic, she was very vocal about hating her experience. She even admitted in interviews that she felt objectified and reduced to just a body and a costume, and that Barbarella was one of her least favorite projects. So, while audiences saw this confident, sexy space heroine flying through psychedelic worlds behind the scenes,
Full of Earth women. I'm about average.
Jane Fonda was fighting a private battle, trying to maintain her dignity while everything, from her marriage to her costume, was falling apart around her. And if you think that's where the drama ends, think again, because next up, we're diving into the shocking secrets behind that infamous costume that nearly drove Jane out of her mind. Now, let's talk about that costume, the infamous, barely hanging on by a thread Barbarella getup that has gone down in movie history as both a fashion statement and a fashion disaster. Seriously, Jane Fonda's outfit in Barbarella wasn't just an outfit, it was a whole saga of its own. First of all, imagine trying to save the galaxy while wearing what can only be described as metal scraps and plastic bits glued together with hopes, prayers, and, of course, lots of double-sided tape. Yep, that's what Jane Fonda was dealing with.
Our magnetic screens are dead.
Force of magnetic hurricane is 11.9. The 0.0.
The costume was supposed to scream futuristic space goddess, but in reality, it was more like a walking wardrobe malfunction. Now, let's talk about the designer. Paco Rabanne is the king of avant-garde fashion at the time. Known for creating wild and space-age designs out of metal, plastic, and even chainmail, Rabanne was famous for pushing boundaries. But, as Jane Fonda quickly found out, pushing fashion boundaries in a movie where you have to move, fight, and float around is not the same as strutting down a runway. These weren't just clothes, they were sculptures that hated movement. And did Jane suffer because of that? Every time she had to film a scene, whether she was floating in zero gravity, escaping alien monsters, or just trying to walk across a room, something would go wrong. Pieces would slip out of place, snap off, or straight up fall apart. There were entire scenes that had to be shot over and over again because her costume just wouldn't cooperate. Remember that iconic scene at the beginning of the movie where Barbarella was crash landing and undressing from her spacesuit? Looks effortless, right? Well, wrong. That one scene reportedly took hours to film, not because of special effects, but because her outfit kept refusing to stay on. Imagine Jane, dangling around on wires for the zero-gravity effect, trying to look seductive, while her clothes were practically attacking her. Not fun. And let's not forget how uncomfortable these outfits were. The metal and plastic materials were cold, rigid, and left bruises and scratches on Jane's skin. In some scenes, she was nearly naked.
See, there was a magnetic storm in my stabilizers.
Perhaps I can help. I'm not without experience in these matters. After all, it is I.
Covered only in sheer or transparent materials that didn't leave much to the imagination. For Jane, who later became a major feminist icon, this was beyond frustrating. She's been very open about how much she hated wearing those outfits. In later interviews, she even called it the worst mistake of her career at that time. She said she felt like a decorative object, and that went against everything she would later stand for, especially as she became more outspoken about women's rights. Yet, here's the weirdest part. Even though Jane absolutely despised the costumes, Barbarella became one of her most famous roles. Isn't that wild? The same movie she wanted to forget ended up making her a style icon for decades. People still talk about Barbarella's look today, and not always in a good way. And if you're wondering how a costume like that even made it into a movie, well, it turns out there was a lot of creative clashing behind the scenes. The director, Roger Vadim, who also happened to be Jane's husband at the time, wanted her to look as sexy and exposed as possible. You can imagine how awkward that must have been for her, especially when the clothes wouldn't stay on. Talk about mixing work with personal life in the worst way. So, while Barbarella's costume is now legendary for its daring and out-of-this-world look, behind the scenes, it was anything but glamorous. Jane Fonda had to fight through wardrobe disasters, personal discomfort, and her own values.
We need him to stand up. We need all of our leaders now to stand up and put an end to this issue of a Texas oil company.
All while trying to make a bizarre sci-fi movie work. In the end, that costume may have looked like a fantasy on screen, but for Jane, it was a real-life nightmare wrapped in plastic and metal. And let's be real. Haven't we all had an outfit that looked great in the mirror but turned into a total mess once we walked out the door? Imagine that, but in front of the entire world. So, next time you see Barbarella's iconic look, remember, behind that sexy space siren was a woman desperately trying to keep her clothes on, and her dignity intact. Now, let's take you in for a treat because the story behind Barbarella's outrageous outfits is so much more than just shiny space fashion. Let's peel back the layers of these gravity-defying, sometimes accidentally falling off costumes and really get into what went down on that set. Picture Jane Fonda floating through space in those glitzy, futuristic get-ups, all metal, plastic, and enough sparkle to blind a small planet. But what most people don't realize is that these outfits were serious nightmares for Jane. Sure, they looked like something from a wild sci-fi dream, but trying to actually move in them, that's a whole different story. The main creative force behind these costumes was none other than Paco Rabanne, a French designer famous for using unconventional materials like metal discs, chains, and plastic to create fashion art. His stuff looked cool on a runway, but in real life, for a movie where the lead actress had to run, fight, and roll around, it was completely impractical.
I've learned from this young scientist the unspeakable secret of the positonic ray. It may give them the power to shatter the loving union of the universe.
Imagine trying to do a cartwheel in a suit of armor that pinches and slides every time you breathe. Yeah, not fun. And here's where it gets even crazier. Instead of thinking, maybe Jane should be able to move her arms, the designers kept pushing the envelope to make her look as otherworldly and sexy as possible. Comfort was the last thing on their minds. The materials were stiff, cold, and didn't stretch. So if Jane needed to, say, reach for a ray gun or jump out of danger, the costume would either dig painfully into her skin or, and this happened a lot, just start slipping off. Can you imagine trying to save a planet while also worrying if your top is about to fall to the floor? Talk about multitasking. And here's a detail that makes it even more awkward. Jane Fonda didn't really get a say in any of this. She wasn't sitting in some Hollywood trailer approving outfits. Nope. She was basically told what to wear.
Pretty. My name isn't pretty, it's Barbarella.
Later on, she confessed that wearing these skimpy, shiny outfits made her feel like a Barbie doll, all dolled up but totally powerless. Even worse, her husband at the time, Roger Vadim, was directing the movie. And let's just say he wasn't exactly rushing to defend her comfort. In fact, many people believed Vadim wanted Jane to wear those revealing outfits to boost his film's sex appeal. Some fans and critics even argued that the way Barbarella was filmed, all close-ups and slow pans, was more about Vadim's personal vision of Jane than anything about her character. Yikes, right? And while today people might call Barbarella a fashion icon and think those costumes are super stylish, for Jane, those outfits were like shiny prison bars. She later admitted that filming those scenes left her feeling vulnerable and uncomfortable, especially when things did fall out of place, which was often. Now imagine this. You're on a set, surrounded by cameras and crew, trying to deliver a serious line about saving the universe.
And remain like this. Here, let me show you. For 1 minute or until full rapport is achieved.
And suddenly, part of your costume pops open or slips down. Total nightmare. And because the outfits were made of metal and plastic, there was no sneaky adjusting. It was either on or off. Jane had to constantly stay stiff and robotic just to keep the costume from malfunctioning, which ironically made her look less natural in scenes that were supposed to be fun and flirty. And get this, the production didn't even bother creating backups or emergency fixes. So when something broke, they had to either tape it up awkwardly or stop filming until someone figured out how to fix it. So while we all remember Barbarella as this glam, shiny space queen, behind the scenes, Jane Fonda was struggling just to hold it together. Literally. Those costumes might have been designed to dazzle, but they definitely failed when it came to the basics, like letting her move without a wardrobe malfunction. Now, that's a Hollywood costume fail for the ages. Oh, let's really break this down because Jane Fonda's Barbarella costume drama is a story that just keeps on giving, and not in a good way. Imagine signing up to play a powerful space adventurer, only to be trapped in an outfit that makes you feel more like a malfunctioning wind-up doll than a fearless heroine. Yeah, that's how bad it was. First of all, let's talk about the materials. Now, you'd think that for a futuristic sci-fi movie, they'd come up with something sleek, comfortable, and maybe a bit stretchy. You know, like what astronauts wear, but make it fashion. Nope. Instead, poor Jane was stuffed into outfits made from hard plastic, stiff metal, and weird vinyl-like fabrics that looked shiny on camera but were a nightmare in real life. These weren't costumes designed to move with her. They were more like wearable cages. She couldn't sit properly, couldn't lift her arms without something shifting dangerously, and heaven forbid if she needed to run, because she couldn't. And let me tell you, those sharp edges, they were real.
Well, all right. But I don't see what good it will do. Do you have any pills?
Imagine wearing something that could poke, scrape, or even slice you if you twisted the wrong way. There are stories of Jane having to pause filming just to adjust her costume because it was digging into her skin. And since there were multiple versions of these costumes, some were so badly fitted that things would literally fall off during scenes. Can you imagine trying to act serious and deliver lines about saving the galaxy while worrying if your entire outfit was about to betray you? Total nightmare. Now, let's get into the revealing part. Because, wow, they really pushed it. Sure, sexy costumes are a thing in movies, but Barbarella's outfits took it to a whole new and totally impractical level. Tiny tops, see-through panels, and plunging necklines that refused to stay in place. Jane has even admitted that every move she made was a gamble. Would the costume stay up, or would it slip and expose her to the entire set? And remember, this was long before computer-generated imagery, CGI, could fix wardrobe mishaps in post-production. What happened on set stayed on set, and not always in a good way. But perhaps the most shocking part of this whole thing is that nobody seemed to care how she felt about it. There she was, the leading lady of the movie, and yet her voice about how uncomfortable and awkward she was feeling went completely unheard. Jane later opened up about how powerless she felt in that moment, as if her job wasn't to act but just to look hot for the camera, And sadly, this wasn't unique to her. Back then, and sometimes still today, Hollywood often put women's looks ahead of their talents, and Barbarella's costume was a glaring example of that. It's almost ironic, right? Barbarella was supposed to be this strong, independent space traveler, yet her costume literally held her back. Instead of focusing on being a hero.
And now, Barbarella, don't you agree with me that in some things, the old-fashioned ways are best?
Jane had to focus on making sure her outfit didn't malfunction. Talk about missing the point. In the end, even though Barbarella became a cult classic, people now look back at Jane's costume as a symbol of what happens when style goes way overboard and totally forgets about practicality. And honestly, it makes you think, what could Barbarella have been if Jane had been given a costume that actually worked for her, instead of against her? So next time you see those iconic images of Jane as Barbarella, remember, behind that fierce look was a woman struggling to hold it all together, literally.